Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Kevin Bessler. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories, including a challenge to the state's gun and magazine ban and the end of the state's Invest in Kids School Choice Scholarship Program in Illinois. Then the Center Square's Dan McCaleb and Brett Rollam will further discuss those stories and more. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Kevin Bessler.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Kevin Bessler. Here are some of the top stories from the past week. The U.S. Supreme Court has docketed a case brought by Illinois State Representative Dan Calkins challenging the state's gun and magazine ban. Greg Bishop reports.
Calkins brought his case in state court earlier this year, and after getting a favorable ruling in Macon County, the Pritzker administration brought an appeal to the Illinois Supreme Court. Calkins' attorneys then motioned for two Illinois Supreme Court justices who received $1 million in campaign contributions from Governor J.B. Pritzker to recuse themselves. That was denied, and in August, the Illinois Supreme Court sided with the state. On Wednesday, Calkins was hopeful the U.S. Supreme Court will look at the perceived conflicts and disqualify the two justices, which could overturn the gun ban.
This is an affront on our Republican form of government. Separation of powers. Really, that was why we took this case to the U.S. Supreme Court.
In updates from other cases, the federal firearms licensees of Illinois filed their motion to block the gun ban registry deadline of January 1st. A Southern District judge denied the state's motion to delay a response, and the status hearing set for December 21st. I'm Greg Bishop.
The reverberation continues following the decision to allow Illinois' only school choice program to expire. Illinois House Speaker Emmanuel Chris Welch never called for a vote on a bill during the fall veto session to extend Invest in Kids past December 31st. Nearly 10,000 students enrolled in the program are now in limbo. State Representative Ryan Spain says letting the program expire is not fair to the kids.
We owe it to our children to further their education, and private schools became the only option of choice that could provide a lifeline for families.
Ava Villalobos is a mother of children who have benefited from the program.
For them to be able to flourish at the pace that they need, all kids learn differently, and private schools are able to tailor that and work with them.
Teachers' unions were the main opponents of Invest in Kids, and they funneled millions of dollars into campaign coffers leading up to the veto session. The Chicago Teachers Union called the end of the program a historic win for public education. Those are the top stories of the week from Illinois. Find out more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, the Center Square's Dan McCaleb and Brett Rolland will discuss the top stories of the week. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Kevin Bessler.
Freedom and liberty are important to all of us in Illinois, from Rockford to Carbondale, from Quincy to Decatur. If you're looking for civil, intellectual conversations with those shaping the future of freedom, try the Future of Freedom podcast with me, Scott Bertrand. We speak with leaders across the country in the greater conservative and libertarian movements. In-depth conversations about where the next intellectual battles will happen across the country. It's the Future of Freedom podcast. Find it at americastalking.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Vice President of News and Content at the Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. Greg Bishop has the day off, can you believe it? So joining me today is the most versatile journalist in the world, Brett Rolland. How are you, Brett?
I'm good. Thanks for that introduction, Dan. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. What deserved. We are recording this on Wednesday, November 15th. Brett, some breaking news today with a court hearing in federal court related to the ComEd 4 corruption trial that's tied to longtime former House Speaker Michael Madigan, who himself goes on corruption-related trial next year, April maybe. Anyway, the news today was that we learned that federal prosecutors are seeking life prison sentences for the 4 ComEd either officials or lobbyists who were convicted earlier this year. You covered the hearing for the centersquare.com. Brett, tell us about it.
So we don't know for sure what they're facing, but Patrick Cotter, the defense attorney, said that the prosecution is going to seek life sentences or essentially life in prison for the 4 clients. Now, we don't know if that means actual life sentences or something that's akin to a life sentence for 4 people who are the youngest of which is 67 years old. They haven't filed anything yet in terms of sentencing. They're expected to file before the end of the year on what they recommend in sentencing. But the guidelines for the case say that it could be up to life in prison. And I think that that's where the contention was over today. So these 4 people were convicted in May. They've had 6 months to sort of work out their approach to sentencing. They asked the judge a couple weeks ago for more time, saying that the complexity of the issues and the sentencing guidelines was going to require multiple rounds of briefings. The judge did not seem inclined to change the sentencing dates today. In fact, he said, you can either go with what the prosecution has suggested or what I've previously set, saying basically you've had plenty of time to look at this and I'm not going to delay the sentencing for this. Patrick Cotter made a plea. Patrick Cotter is the attorney for Mike McLean, who's the close aide to Michael Madigan. McLean will also go on trial with Madigan again next year in April. So we'll have to see where that goes. But Cotter made a pretty heartfelt plea, basically saying, in light of what's going on, we need more time. He said the government apparently is going to suggest the guidelines of this case are life, and we are asking for what we believe to be adequate time, a couple of extra weeks, to respond not only to the pre-sentencing report, but also to what the government files when they're asking to put our clients in jail for life. And I think that's not unreasonable. The judge wasn't having it. Judge Leineweber said no. He has been pretty firm about his dates throughout this process, which, remember, started years ago. So I can't imagine this is much of a surprise, but that was the situation we were dealing with today. So it'll be interesting to see sort of what happens next. Now, we have a lot of these, the prosecutors won't file sentencing recommendations until pretty much the end of the year. So it's going to be an interesting holiday season for these folks who are now all out free with no sort of restrictions. But this could be a difficult holiday season.
So I'm going to ask you about the potential for a lifetime prison sentence here in a second. But while we talked exhaustively about the ComEd 4 trial, back when the trial was going on and leading up to the trial, we really haven't talked about it much in the last several months. So if you could just summarize what the 4 defendants were convicted of doing, just in a minute and a half or whatever, just remind our listeners what the allegations were against ComEd, because of course ComEd, the company itself, a few years ago, pleaded guilty, for lack of a better term. It's a private company. You're not putting a private company in prison, of course, but they paid a hefty, I think, $200 million fine, if memory is correct. So they admitted it a few years ago, and now their former CEO and lobbyists are working for them. They were convicted of these federal charges and do face serious prison time, as you just said. But just refresh our memory, what were the allegations? What were these ComEd folks doing with Michael Madigan?
Sure thing. So the government alleged essentially a 9-year conspiracy between former state lawmaker and lobbyist Michael McLean, former ComEd CEO Ann Pramaggiore, former ComEd lobbyist John Hooker, and former contract lobbyist Jay Doherty. Essentially, the prosecution says that those 4 attempted to bribe Madigan with no-show jobs, contracts, payments to associates, in exchange for essentially legislation that would help ComEd in Springfield.
Financially help ComEd, mostly.
Yes, they essentially would help the company's bottom line.
Right.
And they were all convicted in May in a jury trial. Since then, there have been a couple motions back and forth, not a ton, but a few. First, the defense asked to poll the jurors. The judge said no way to that. And now they're asking for a little bit more time on sentencing. And again, the judge said no to that.
Let me ask you this. In your experience covering courts, crime, with the Center Square, with previous stints in the newspaper business, is life in prison for essentially a white-collar crime? Corruption is serious in Illinois. Of course, we know that. 3 former Illinois governors in the last 25 years or 30 years or whatever it is, have gone to prison. Corruption needs to be taken seriously here. Were you surprised when you heard, obviously it was a defense attorney, it wasn't the prosecutors who brought this up in court this morning, when you heard that the defense attorney said that the prosecution is seeking life prison sentences?
I was shocked to hear that. Patrick Cotter seems to be a very skilled attorney. And I assume that he knows what he's doing. But yes, it was a surprise. So I'm not sure if he was referring to, hey, because of the age of my client, I think his client, Michael McLean, is 75. So that's not young. So any significant time you could view as a life sentence for McLean. Other folks have not faced life in prison. Even Rod Blagojevich, former Illinois governor, he was sentenced to 14 years, which, I'm sure you remember, then President Donald Trump commuted his sentence. So he ended up serving about 8. Before him, Governor George Ryan got about 6.5. But he got out a little early too and did some supervised release and stuff like that. So life seems like a big ask here, but we'll see. We'll have to see. So I think it'll come down to and we'll know a whole lot more once some of those pre-sentencing reports come out. So we'll know what the recommendations are, what the defense is arguing for, what prosecutors are recommending. The judge will ultimately make the decision. I would be surprised by a life sentence.
Well, we look forward to your continued reporting on this, Brett. And as a reminder to our listeners, you can find all of our coverage on the ComEd 4 trial, on all news related to Illinois and the rest of the country, for that matter, at thecentersquare.com. But let's move on. Some new information this week off the gun ban that Illinois enacted. The Governor J.B. Pritzker enacted in January after the legislature passed these new restrictions on 170 semi-automatic firearms and rifles and also accessories. It looks like the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, might be taking up this case at some point.
So they have put it on their docket. Now, just exactly what that means and where it'll go, I'm not clear on yet, but that will become clear as this plays out. So after Pritzker signed the bill that the General Assembly had passed, that banned about 170 semi-automatic firearms and magazines. The ban has been challenged in several different lawsuits from a couple different angles. So there's a lot of pending cases here going on still. We'll have to see sort of where they go from here. I don't think either side should be breathing a sigh of relief yet. I think it's way too early in that process. The state is going ahead with enforcing the ban that's already been enacted. So those are the rules in place today. But where these pan out, I think is going to become real interesting. There's a couple different things that we'll have to see where they go. The case is far from closed, I think is the bottom line here, Dan.
No doubt. As you mentioned, dozens of lawsuits were filed in both state courts and federal courts. The state courts cases there seem to be mostly wrapped up, siding with lawmakers and with Governor Pritzker, saying the restrictions, the ban on these semi-automatic handguns and rifles is not unconstitutional from a state standpoint. Now, still ongoing is these federal cases. As you said, U.S. Supreme Court put it on its docket, which means they may hear it at some point in the future because those federal challenges to the law are still ongoing. Also, we've got this registry that was part of the law. Illinois FOID card owners, gun owners who pre-owned these now banned weapons, who owned them before this law was enacted in January, are now required to register those weapons that are now banned with state police. And that is still ongoing. Right now, that's being challenged as well. Separately, but as far as you know, that requirement is still in place. Folks who don't register, individuals who do not register their now banned firearms with state police could face criminal sanctions as of January 1st. That's still the case as far as you know? Yes, that's still the case, and I think that the real contention is around the Illinois Supreme Court ruling. As you know, gun rights groups had asked for 2 of the judges who received $1 million plus donations from Pritzker to step aside. Those judges did not do that. They ended up siding with the state in the case. So whether those conflicts of interest get a hearing at a higher level will certainly be interesting. And how that plays out, I think, could potentially have a big impact in Illinois. We'll continue to follow this story, and any developments you can read about at thecentersquare.com, the Illinois State page there. Moving on again, Illinois and states across the country received billions of dollars in federal COVID-19 relief dollars in 2020, 2021. There were parameters that they could use that money for. Most financial experts said you can't use it on recurring expenses because that money is not going to be here forever. Some states used it on those one-time expenses. Some states used it on a mix of things, including creating new programs that would have recurring costs, meaning year over year, year after year after year after year, they'd have to pay into it. That federal money is running out soon. And Illinois is one of the states that was listed as facing a potential fiscal cliff because of how they used some of those federal relief COVID dollars. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this is a pretty interesting report from the Volcker Alliance. Even more interesting, I think, is that this coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds, this is called SLFRF, was the program that Congress gave about $350 billion to states and local municipalities for their COVID response. Now, nationwide, about 45% of that money has been spent so far. Remember, it's now 2023, and the pandemic for many people is in the rearview mirror. So a lot of this money hasn't been spent. The money's going to run out. So the Volcker Alliance looked at states that had spent like more than 2.5% of their general fund expenditures on recurring costs. And Illinois was one of the 12 states that did that. Now, Illinois lawmakers and the governor knew that this was one-time money, but perhaps they've got a plan for this that we don't know about here. Maybe they've got a new revenue source or a plan in place here. But a lot of this stuff, the Volcker Alliance said, hey, this is concerning spending because you used it for recurring purposes, knowing that it was one-time money and that there's an end date to it. So we'll have to see what happens next here, Dan. I think that the states that have done this could potentially face having to cut these programs or have to come up with a way to pay for them on their own without that federal money.
And essentially that means that would mean either cutting programs, cutting specific programs, cutting the state budget across the board, or hiking taxes in Illinois.
Right. Yeah, coming up with some other revenue source, with generally taxes, fines, fees, or other ways to generate money from the residents who live in Illinois. So we'll have to see where this one goes.
And one last question, I guess, about this is the Volcker report specifically says Illinois faces a moderate to elevated risk of encountering that fiscal cliff. Fiscal cliff. Can you just?
So essentially, they're saying that your budget gap, if you intend to fund this program in the future, is going to be a lot larger because of the way you spent the money. Because you spent it on recurring costs, that you're going to have essentially a bigger budget hole to fill. And sometimes they call that a fiscal cliff, like you're going to run right off it. I always think about the Roadrunner when I see fiscal cliff, but essentially it's a budget hole, which is not something that Illinois is very familiar with. I don't think that this is going to shock many of the politicians in Springfield, but we'll have to see what the game plan is when this money runs out.
Interesting. Thank you, Brett. Another recurring story that we've been covering for many months at thecentersquare.com, and we've talked about it on Illinois in Focus, is the migrant situation. Particularly in Chicago, for a little more than a year. Well, of course, since President Biden took office, changed immigration policies, opened the border up to more individuals crossing the border, some legally, some illegally. Texas, in particular, has borne the brunt of this inflated illegal immigration. Governor Greg Abbott of Texas last summer came up with a plan because the state was so overrun with migrants, came up with a plan to bus thousands of these migrants to so-called sanctuary cities and sanctuary states. Sanctuary cities, sanctuary states are those that have designated themselves as welcoming border crossers, migrants, etc. Their communities do not cooperate with immigrations and customs enforcement to turn over migrants who might be here illegally, etc. And in Chicago, Illinois is a sanctuary state. Chicago is a sanctuary city. So Chicago was one of those destination cities that Governor Abbott of Texas started busing migrants to. And since then, The number changes every day because it grows every day, but we know that more than 20,000 migrants were bused from Texas to Chicago, and it's been an ongoing crisis in Chicago. They don't have any place to house. They've run out of places to house many of these migrants. They've spent hundreds of millions of dollars already in resources and in actual cash and coming up with services for these migrants. And now there's at least one local activist who's saying that Chicago should end its sanctuary city status. Tell us about it.
So we've seen some sentiments like this bubble up over the past couple of months. There have been issues, as some of it's been like not in my backyard type of stuff that has creeped up with migrant shelters. But there seems to be some, however large or small, group of people who are saying it's time to end the sanctuary city status for Chicago. Tio Hardiman, who's a familiar name to a lot of Chicago residents, basically said it's time to reverse the policy. It's not working, and that they simply don't have the resources to deal with it.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Brett, but outside of the migrant crisis that's adding to the burden, Chicago had financial problems already. They had a massive budget gap heading into its next fiscal year. Of course, homelessness prior to the migrant crisis was already a big problem. Of course, something else we talked about, crime, violent crime, gun-related to crime in Chicago was a huge issue. And now you add on top of all these other issues, 20,000 and growing number of migrants flocking to the city.
It's a huge challenge, Dan. I don't think that it can be understated. I think that, Chicago for at least some period of time was losing population. And now we've had this influx of a population that can't legally work in the country, that doesn't necessarily have a place to stay, doesn't have a ton of funds. And these are people who truly need help. But the best way to deliver that help and it remains a question I think that a lot of people are still looking at. And Tio Hardiman is saying essentially, we don't have the bandwidth for this. It's not working, and that's tough. And we've seen it crop up at a couple other places too. That Chicago's, for so long welcomed, and now there seems to be some pushback to this idea that we can welcome forever. Without consequence.
And of course, it's the middle of November. Brett, next week is Thanksgiving week. Happy Thanksgiving, by the way, because I think you're off next week. Greg returns next week, so I won't see you or talk to you before Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving. But of course, with Thanksgiving comes December, and then January, and then February. And while we've had currently unseasonably warm temperatures now, that bitter cold is coming. That freezing temperatures, snow, ice, etc. They're talking about building. They've got this massive area blocked off in the city where they are talking about putting up like a so-called tent city to house these migrants. But tent cities and sub-zero temperatures, I don't know how they work well. Whether they work well together or not.
I don't think they work well. I typically wouldn't. This isn't weather that I'd want to be outside. I mean, today is great.
Beautiful.
But as you mentioned, it is going to get very cold. Chicago's winter is not a short period of time.
I do appreciate your insight into all the news this week. Enjoy your vacation next week. Happy Thanksgiving, but we are out of time. Listeners can keep up with all of the stories we talked about today and more at thecentersquare.com. For Brett Rowland, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe. Thank you for listening.